The wagon wheel hit another deep rut in the trail, sending Sarah Mitchell lurching sideways. Her hands gripped the wooden seat as her father shouted at the horses, trying to keep them steady on the rough mountain path. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on their small wagon train as it made its way through the Colorado Territory in the summer of 1882. Sarah had been traveling for 3 months now, leaving behind the green hills of Ohio for the promise of land out west. She was 23 years old, unmarried and, according to her mother's final wishes, supposed to be joining her aunt in Denver. But her father had other ideas. Thomas Mitchell was a stubborn man who believed the real opportunity lay in the silver mines near Leadville. He'd convinced Sarah to come along, promising they'd visit her aunt after he made his fortune. Now, as the wagon bounced along the treacherous mountain road, Sarah wondered if they would even survive the journey. The wagon train consisted of 5 families, all chasing dreams of wealth and new beginnings. They'd been warned about bandits, hostile encounters, and the dangerous terrain, but nothing had prepared Sarah for the sheer isolation of these mountains. The peaks loomed around them like giants, their snow-capped summits touching the clouds. Pine forests stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by rocky outcroppings and rushing streams. As they rounded a particularly sharp bend, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. One of the wagon wheels on their vehicle looked loose. She leaned over to get a better view, calling out to her father about her concern. He waved her off dismissively, too focused on navigating the narrow trail that hugged the mountainside. To their left, the ground dropped away into a steep ravine, at least 100 feet down to the rocky bottom where a river rushed through. The loose wheel suddenly gave way with a sickening crack. The wagon lurched violently to the side, and Sarah felt herself sliding across the seat. Her father grabbed for her but missed, his own hands occupied with trying to control the panicked horses. Time seemed to slow as Sarah felt her body tipping over the edge of the wagon. The ravine yawned below her, ready to swallow her whole. Then, strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her backwards with such force that the breath rushed from her lungs. She found herself pressed against a solid chest, her feet dangling in the air for a moment before being set firmly on the ground. A deep voice near her ear said those words that would echo in her mind for years to come. "You're safe with me." Sarah turned to see her rescuer. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. A worn cowboy hat sat on his head, and his clothes spoke of long days in the saddle. A bandana around his neck was covered in trail dust, and his leather boots had seen better days. But there was something in his steady gaze that made Sarah feel truly safe for the first time since leaving Ohio. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, still shaking from the near-death experience. Her legs felt weak, and she might have fallen if he hadn't kept one hand on her elbow, steadying her. "James Crawford, ma'am," he introduced himself, tipping his hat slightly. "I've been riding scout for your wagon train since you crossed into the high country. Saw that wheel giving you trouble about a mile back and rode up quick as I could." The other wagons had stopped now, and people were gathering around to see what had happened. Sarah's father climbed down from the damaged wagon, his face pale as he realized how close he'd come to losing his daughter. He shook James's hand vigorously, thanking him over and over. The wagon master, a grizzled man named Dutch Henderson, assessed the damage. The wheel was completely broken, and they'd need to make camp while repairs were made. It would take at least a day, maybe 2. He announced they'd set up here for the night, even though it wasn't the ideal location. There was a small clearing about 100 yards back where they could circle the wagons. As the families began the work of making camp, Sarah couldn't help but notice James Crawford. He moved with quiet confidence, helping the men unhitch the horses and assess the damage to her father's wagon. He had a natural authority about him, the kind that came from years of hard living and making life-or-death decisions in the wilderness. When he spoke, people listened. That evening, as the campfires were lit and the smell of cooking food filled the air, Sarah learned more about their mysterious scout. James had been guiding wagon trains and cattle drives through these mountains for nearly a decade. He knew every pass, every water source, every place where danger might lurk. He was originally from Texas, he told them, but had drifted north after the war, looking for something he couldn't quite name. "These mountains," he said, gazing up at the darkening peaks, and they have a way of showing a man who he really is. "Strip away all the pretense, all the lies we tell ourselves. Up here, you're either honest or you're dead." Sarah found herself drawn to his quiet wisdom. Unlike the men she'd known back in Ohio, James didn't fill the silence with empty words. He seemed comfortable with quiet, letting the crackling fire and distant wolf howls speak for themselves. When he did talk, his words carried weight, earned through experience rather than education. As the night deepened and stars appeared in breathtaking abundance overhead, Sarah wrapped herself in a blanket and sat near the fire. Her father had already turned in, exhausted from the day's events. Most of the camp was settling down for the night, but James remained, checking the perimeter, making sure everything was secure. When he finally sat down across the fire from her, Sarah found the courage to speak. "You saved my life today, Mr. Crawford. I don't know how I can ever repay you." He looked at her through the dancing flames, his expression unreadable. "No repayment needed, Miss Mitchell. It's what any decent man would do. But you were there at exactly the right moment," she persisted. "Like fate put you there." A slight smile crossed his weathered face. "Don't believe in fate much, ma'am. I believe in keeping your eyes open and being ready when trouble comes. Trouble always comes in these mountains. Question is whether you're prepared for it." His words proved more prophetic than either of them could have known. As Sarah finally retired to the wagon to sleep, she had no idea that this was just the beginning of an adventure that would test everything. She thought she knew about courage, trust, and the true meaning of safety in a wild and unforgiving land. The morning broke cold and clear over the mountain camp. Sarah woke to the sound of hammering as the men worked to repair the broken wagon wheel. Her father was already up, helping where he could, though it was clear James Crawford and Dutch Henderson were doing most of the skilled work. They'd found wood suitable for a new spoke, but shaping it properly would take time. Sarah busied herself helping Mrs. Patterson, one of the other travelers, prepare breakfast for the group. The older woman was full of gossip and opinions, and this morning her topic was their handsome scout. "That James Crawford is a mystery, mark my words," Mrs. Patterson said as she stirred a pot of porridge. "A man doesn't ride alone through these mountains without a past he's running from. My Henry says he's heard stories about Crawford down in the mining camps. Some say he was a lawman once. Others claim he was on the wrong side of the law." Sarah found herself defensive, though she barely knew the man. "He saved my life yesterday. That's all I need to know about his character." Mrs. Patterson gave her a knowing look. "Oh, I'm not saying he's a bad man, dear. Just saying he's got secrets. They all do, these wanderers. Question is whether those secrets will bring trouble down on the rest of us." The conversation was interrupted by shouting from the edge of camp. Sarah hurried over to find several men gathered around James, who was kneeling on the ground examining tracks in the soft earth. His face was grim. "Unshod ponies," he was saying to Dutch Henderson. "At least 6 riders, maybe more. Circled our camp last night while we slept. They were close enough to count our numbers." "Indians?" Mr. Patterson asked nervously, his hand moving to the rifle at his side. James shook his head. "Could be Utes, but more likely outlaws. There's a gang that's been working these mountains, preying on wagon trains. They use Indian tactics to throw off pursuit. Either way, we need to be ready." Dutch Henderson made the decision quickly. "We'll finish the wheel repair and move out by noon. No more delays. Crawford, you think they'll hit us?" James stood brushing dirt from his knees. "Depends on what they saw. We've got 5 wagons, maybe 15 men who can handle a gun. If they think we're easy pickings, they'll try. If not, they'll wait for easier prey." The camp transformed from a place of relative ease to one of nervous preparation. The men checked their weapons while the women gathered the children close. Sarah noticed her father loading an old pistol she didn't even know he owned. His hands shook slightly, and she realized with a start that Thomas Mitchell, for all his bravado about seeking fortune in the West, was truly afraid. James approached them as they worked. "Mr. Mitchell, I'll need your daughter to ride in the Henderson wagon today. It's in the middle of the train, safest position. And that pistol you're loading, make sure it's actually loaded properly. Seen more men hurt themselves with firearms than with enemy bullets." Thomas bristled at the instruction, but James's tone left no room for argument. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order from a man who knew how to survive. "I can handle myself," Sarah spoke up. "I know how to shoot. My father taught me back in Ohio." James looked at her with those steady gray eyes, assessing. "Shooting targets in Ohio and shooting men trying to kill you are 2 different things, Miss Mitchell. But if it comes to that, I won't stop you from defending yourself. Just remember, the first shot's the hardest one to take. After that, it's either them or you." By noon, the wagon was repaired and the train began moving again. Sarah rode in the Henderson wagon as instructed, squeezed between Mrs. Henderson and a basket of supplies. She could see James riding ahead, constantly scanning the terrain. He'd position himself on high ground, study their surroundings, then ride back to adjust their route. The trail climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner and the wagons strained with the effort. Twice they had to stop and use ropes to help pull the wagons up particularly steep sections. It was exhausting work and everyone knew it made them vulnerable. If the outlaws were going to attack, these choke points would be ideal. As the afternoon wore on, the tension became unbearable. Every shadow between the trees looked like a hiding place. Every bird taking flight seemed like a signal. The children, sensing their parents' fear, grew quiet and clingy. Then, as they navigated a narrow passage between two rocky outcroppings, James suddenly rode back at full gallop. "Ambush ahead," he shouted. "Get the wagons circled now." Everything happened at once. Dutch Henderson started barking orders, the wagons attempting to form a defensive circle in the limited space. Men grabbed rifles and took positions. Women pushed children under the wagons, using the wooden sides as shields. Sarah found herself with a rifle in her hands, her father pressing it on her before taking his own position. Through a gap in the wagon wheels, she could see riders emerging from the trees. They weren't Indians, as some had feared, but rough-looking men on horseback, faces covered with bandanas. She counted at least 8 of them. One rider, larger than the rest on a black horse, moved forward. "We don't want trouble," he called out. "Just give us your valuables and any silver you're carrying and we'll let you pass. Otherwise, we'll take it over your bodies." Sarah saw James position himself at the front of their defensive circle. He'd dismounted and had a rifle trained on the outlaw leader. "And I'm telling you to ride away while you still can," James called back. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Don't be stupid enough to die over a few dollars." It was a bluff, Sarah realized. They weren't outnumbered at all. But James said it with such confidence that she saw several of the outlaws shift nervously in their saddles. The leader laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's James Crawford, boys. The famous gunfighter. Thought you'd given up that life, Crawford. Thought you'd gone soft playing nursemaid to pilgrims. I've given up killing men who don't need killing," James replied calmly. "But I'll make an exception if you push me. Last chance to ride away." The tension stretched thin as wire. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her finger rested on the trigger of the rifle, and she wondered if she'd have the courage to actually use it. Then, from somewhere to the left, a shot rang out. One of the outlaws jerked and fell from his horse. The peaceful mountain afternoon exploded into chaos as both sides opened fire. Sarah saw James drop the outlaw leader with a single shot, before taking cover behind a wagon wheel. The air filled with gun smoke and the screams of horses. Sarah found herself firing without conscious thought, working the rifle's action and squeezing the trigger at the shadowy figures moving between the trees. She had no idea if she hit anything. The noise was deafening and time seemed to lose meaning. It could have been seconds or hours before the shooting finally stopped. When the smoke cleared, 3 outlaws lay dead, including their leader. The rest had fled into the forest, dragging 2 wounded companions with them. On the wagon train side, Mr. Patterson had taken a bullet through the shoulder and one of the Henderson boys had been grazed across the forehead. But miraculously, no one had been killed. James moved through the aftermath like a man who'd seen it all before. He checked the bodies, making sure there were no wounded outlaws who might cause trouble. He helped tend to the injured, his hands steady as he packed Mr. Patterson's wound with cloth. And through it all, he remained calm, that same quiet strength that had saved Sarah from falling off the wagon. As evening approached, and they made camp in a more defensible position, Sarah found herself shaking uncontrollably. The reality of what had happened was settling in. She'd been in a gunfight. She'd fired at other human beings. She might have killed someone. James found her sitting alone, staring at her hands. Without a word, he sat down beside her. Not too close, respecting her space, but near enough that she didn't feel alone. "It doesn't get easier," he said quietly. "Anyone who says it does is lying or broken. But you did what you had to do to survive, Miss Mitchell, to protect your father and these people. There's no shame in that." Sarah looked at him, this man who'd become so important to her in such a short time. "How do you do it? How do you live with it?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks. "You remember why you did it. You hold on to the people you saved, not the ones you couldn't save. And you try to be better tomorrow than you were today. His words offered no easy comfort, but somehow they helped. As darkness fell over the camp and the stars emerged once more, Sarah understood that she'd crossed a threshold. She wasn't the same woman who'd left Ohio 3 months ago. The West was changing her, shaping her into someone new. And James Crawford, the mysterious cowboy who'd saved her life, was somehow at the center of that transformation. The wagon train made better time over the next few days, pushing hard to get out of the high country where outlaws operated with impunity. Mr. Patterson recovered slowly from his shoulder wound, his wife caring for him with fierce devotion. The Henderson boy wore his forehead scar like a badge of honor, telling anyone who would listen about the great battle. But the attack had changed the dynamics of the group. People moved with more purpose now, less dreaming and more surviving. The reality of the West had stripped away their romantic notions. Sarah noticed her father had grown quieter, more thoughtful. The silver mines near Leadville seemed less important to him now than simply reaching Denver alive. James continued to scout ahead, but Sarah noticed he stayed closer to the wagon train now. Several times she caught him watching her father's wagon as if making sure she was safe. Their eyes would meet across the camp at night, and something unspoken would pass between them. Mrs. Patterson's gossip now included knowing looks in Sarah's direction, suggesting that the handsome scout had taken a special interest in Thomas Mitchell's daughter. On the 5th day after the attack, they reached a small settlement called Timber Creek. It was barely a town, just a trading post, a blacksmith, a rough saloon, and a few scattered buildings. But it represented civilization, a place where they could resupply and rest before the final push to Denver. Dutch Henderson announced they'd stay for 2 days. The men needed to check the wagons thoroughly, replace any worn parts, and let the horses rest. The women rejoiced at the prospect of sleeping in actual beds at the trading post's boarding house. Even if those beds were just straw mattresses in a shared room, Sarah was helping unload supplies when James appeared at her side. Up close, she could see the weariness in his face, the weight of responsibility he'd been carrying. "Miss Mitchell, I wonder if you might take a walk with me. There's something I need to tell you." Her heart quickened, though she wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. She nodded, and they walked away from the busy camp toward a small stream that ran past the settlement. The sound of rushing water provided privacy from curious ears. James stood for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was heavy. "That outlaw leader, the one I shot, his name was Jack Morrison. We rode together once years ago, before I changed my ways." Sarah felt a chill run through her. Mrs. Patterson's gossip about James having a past suddenly seemed more significant. "I was 19 when the war ended," James continued, staring at the water. "Came home to Texas to find my family's ranch burned, my parents dead. I was angry, lost, fell in with a bad crowd. Jack Morrison's crowd. We robbed banks, stagecoaches, anything that seemed to have money. I told myself we were just taking from the rich, that the war had made outlaws of all of us." He paused, his jaw tight with old pain. "Then one day we robbed a bank in a small town in New Mexico. Jack shot the banker, an old man who was reaching for his glasses, not a gun. I saw that man's wife come running, saw her fall over his body crying, and I knew I couldn't do it anymore. I left that night, rode north, and never looked back." "But they came after you," Sarah guessed. James nodded. "Jack swore he'd kill me for betraying the gang. That was 8 years ago. I became a scout, learned these mountains, tried to make up for the things I'd done. I changed my name for a while, but eventually I figured running from your past is like running from your shadow. It's always there." Sarah processed this information, understanding why he'd been so effective during the ambush. He'd known how outlaws thought because he'd been one. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because after what happened, people will talk. Word spreads in these settlements. Someone might recognize my name, tell stories about who I used to be. I wanted you to hear the truth from me first." He finally turned to look at her, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes. "You're a good woman, Miss Mitchell. You deserve to know who saved your life that day. Not the man I am now, but the man I was." Sarah took a moment to respond, watching the sunlight dance on the stream's surface. "My mother used to say that what Matters isn't where you've been, but where you're going. You're not that angry boy anymore, James. You're the man who's guided us safely through these mountains, the man who protected us from your old life. Some would say I brought that danger to you, he said bitterly. And I'd say you ended it, Sarah replied firmly. Jack Morrison would have attacked some wagon train eventually. Better it was one with you to defend it. Something shifted in James's expression, a tension releasing. You're a remarkable woman, Sarah Mitchell. Your father raised you well. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and she felt the intimacy of it. Sarah's fine, she said softly. I think after someone saves your life, formality seems a bit silly. They walked back to camp slowly, neither rushing to return to the others. Sarah found herself telling him about Ohio, about her mother's death from influenza the previous winter, about how her aunt in Denver was her mother's sister and the only family she had left besides her father. Your father, he seems like he's having second thoughts about the mining venture, James observed. Sarah smiled sadly. The reality of the West isn't matching his dreams. I think he's realizing that silver isn't worth dying for. Smart man, James said. Most figure that out too late. That evening, the settlement came alive as travelers and locals gathered at the saloon. Sarah stayed at the boarding house with the other women and children, but she could hear music and laughter drifting through the evening air. Her father had gone to the saloon with the other men, probably to hear news and gossip from Denver. Around 9 o'clock, Thomas Mitchell burst into the boarding house, his face flushed with excitement. Sarah, pack your things. We're leaving for Denver first thing in the morning. But father, Dutch said we'd rest here for 2 days. Never mind that. I've just learned that your Aunt Margaret is ill. Nothing fatal, but she needs family. We'll hire James Crawford as a private guide. He's agreed to take us through the lower pass. We'll reach Denver a week ahead of the wagon train. Sarah's heart lurched. A week alone on the trail with her father and James. It was improper, potentially scandalous. But if her aunt was truly ill, what choice did they have? She found James outside the boarding house, leaning against a post and watching the stars. Is it true? You've agreed to guide us to Denver? He nodded. Your father offered good money and the lower pass is safer this time of year. We'll make better time than the wagon train. Get your aunt the help she needs sooner. And what about propriety? Sarah asked, lowering her voice. People will talk about me traveling with 2 men, no other women present. James met her eyes steadily. People always talk, Sarah. Question is whether you let that stop you from doing what's right. Your aunt needs you. That's what matters. She knew he was right, but something in his gaze made her pulse quicken. This would be different from traveling in the wagon train, just the 3 of them in the wilderness, relying on each other completely. It felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with outlaws or mountain trails. When do we leave? She asked. Dawn. Pack light. We'll be moving fast. As Sarah lay in bed that night listening to the other women's soft breathing around her, she couldn't sleep. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter of this journey, one that would take her closer to her destination, but also deeper into something she didn't quite understand, something that had started when strong arms caught her as she fell, when a deep voice promised she was safe. She thought about James's past, about the young outlaw who'd become a protector. She thought about her own transformation, from an Ohio girl who'd never left her hometown, to a woman who'd survived an ambush and fired a gun at other human beings. The West was stripping away everything superficial, revealing who people truly were underneath. And who was James Crawford really? A reformed outlaw trying to atone for his past? A lonely man drifting through life? Or something more, something she was just beginning to see? Tomorrow would bring answers, or perhaps only more questions. But as Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, she found herself eager for dawn, ready for whatever the journey would bring. The mountains had become more than just obstacles to overcome. They'd become a crucible, testing and transforming everyone who dared to cross them. And somehow Sarah knew that by the time they reached Denver, she would be someone entirely new. The only question was whether James Crawford would be part of that new life, or just another memory from the dangerous trail that had brought her here. They left Timber Creek as the first light touched the mountain peaks, turning them gold and pink. Sarah rode her father's spare horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, while Thomas handled their wagon alone. James led the way on his sturdy roan, setting a pace that was fast but manageable. The lower pass was indeed easier terrain than what the wagon train would face. The trail was wider, with fewer steep climbs and treacherous descents. They made excellent progress that first day, covering nearly 20 miles before James called a halt in a protected meadow near a creek. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced, already scanning the area with those alert eyes. Good water, defensible position, plenty of grass for the horses. Sarah helped her father unhitch the team while James gathered firewood. There was an efficiency to their movements, each person knowing their role without needing instruction. By the time darkness fell, they had a comfortable camp established, with a fire burning cheerfully and the smell of coffee filling the air. Thomas Mitchell seemed more relaxed now, away from the pressures of the wagon train. Over dinner he told stories about Sarah's mother, about their courtship back in Pennsylvania before they'd settled in Ohio. Sarah listened, treasuring these glimpses into her parents' past. James sat quietly, contributing little but listening intently, his presence somehow making the intimate family moment feel complete rather than intruded upon. After Thomas retired to the wagon, Sarah remained by the fire. James should have taken first watch, but instead he sat with her, poking at the embers with a stick. "Your father loves you very much," he said quietly. "Talks about you constantly, how you cared for your mother in her final illness, how you never complained about leaving everything you knew to come west." "He needs something to believe in," Sarah replied. "After Mother died, he was lost. The idea of silver mines, of striking it rich, it gave him purpose again, even if that purpose is fading now." James nodded, understanding. Purpose is a tricky thing. Sometimes we find it in the strangest places. "What's your purpose, James?" Sarah asked boldly. The darkness and the intimacy of the firelight made her brave. "Is it just wandering these mountains forever, guiding strangers to their destinations?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was thoughtful. "I used to think my purpose was atonement, making up for the wrongs I'd done. But lately I've been wondering if maybe that's not enough. If maybe I'm meant to actually build something instead of just trying to tear down my past." "Build what?" "A life, I suppose. A real one. Not just existing day to day, but actually having something that matters. Someone who matters." The way he looked at her when he said that last part made Sarah's breath catch. She'd been trying to ignore the growing attraction between them, telling herself it was just gratitude for him saving her life. But sitting here in the firelight, far from the judgment of others, she couldn't deny the truth anymore. "That would require staying in one place," she said carefully, putting down roots. "Is that something you think you could do?" James studied her face in the flickering light. "For the right reason? Yes, I think I could." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and promise. Then James stood abruptly. "I should check the perimeter. Get some rest, Sarah. Tomorrow's another long day." Sarah watched him disappear into the darkness, her heart racing. Something had shifted between them tonight, something that couldn't be taken back. She lay awake in the wagon for a long time, listening to her father's snoring and the sounds of the night, wondering what she was doing. Falling for a man with a dangerous past, a man who lived on the edge of civilization, was foolish, wasn't it? The next 3 days followed a similar pattern. They rose early, traveled hard, and made camp in the evening. The terrain gradually changed as they descended from the high mountains into the foothills. Pine forest gave way to aspen groves, and the air grew warmer and easier to breathe. Thomas Mitchell seemed to gain new energy as they approached Denver. He talked eagerly about seeing his sister-in-law again, about finding proper doctors to help with her illness. The silver mines were barely mentioned anymore. Sarah realized her father had found a new purpose, one centered on family rather than fortune. But the closer they got to Denver, the more withdrawn James became. He spoke less, spent more time riding ahead or checking their back trail. Sarah felt him pulling away from her, and it hurt in a way she hadn't expected. On the 4th evening, camped in a beautiful valley with Denver visible as a smudge of buildings in the distance below them, Sarah confronted him. Thomas had gone to the creek to wash up, leaving them alone by the fire. "You're leaving," she said bluntly. "Once you get us to Denver, you're going to disappear back into the mountains." "Aren't you?" James didn't insult her by denying it. "It's what I do, Sarah. I'm a wanderer. Denver's no place for a man like me." "That's an excuse," she said, anger rising. You're running again. Just like you ran from Jack Morrison's gang. You're afraid to stay, afraid to actually build that life you talked about. His jaw tightened. You don't know what you're asking. I've got blood on my hands, a past that won't stay buried. You deserve better than that. You deserve a respectable life in Denver with your aunt. Maybe marriage to a nice shopkeeper or banker. Not a reformed outlaw who might bring trouble to your door. Don't I get a say in what I deserve? Sarah demanded. You saved my life, James. You protected me, taught me to be strong. You showed me that the West isn't just about survival. It's about becoming who you're meant to be. And who I'm meant to be includes you. James stood, his face tortured. Sarah, you're grateful. That's all this is. Once you've been in Denver a few weeks, you'll forget about me. You'll realize I was just a chapter in your journey west, not the destination. Is that what you think? Sarah stood too, facing him across the fire. That I'm some foolish girl who can't tell the difference between gratitude and love? The word hung in the air between them, shocking them both. Sarah hadn't meant to say it, but now that it was out, she wouldn't take it back. James crossed around the fire in 3 long strides, taking her shoulders in his hands. His gray eyes searched her face desperately. You don't know what you're saying, love. We've known each other less than 2 weeks. I know enough, Sarah said firmly. I know you're the bravest man I've ever met. I know you carry your guilt like a weight, but you've earned your redemption 10 times over. I know that when I'm with you, I feel safer and more alive than I've ever felt before. And I know that letting you ride away would be the biggest mistake of my life. For a long moment, James just stared at her. Then with a sound that was half laugh and half sob, he pulled her into his arms. His kiss was gentle at first, almost reverent, then deeper, more passionate. Sarah melted into him, into the strength and warmth she'd been dreaming about since that first moment when he'd caught her falling. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. I'm terrified, he admitted. I don't know how to do this, how to be the man you deserve. You don't have to be perfect, Sarah whispered. You just have to be honest. Be yourself, stay. Your father, James said suddenly, pulling back. He'll never approve. I'm not what he wants for you. Sarah smiled, touching his cheek. Let me worry about my father. He spent this whole journey watching us. He's not blind, James, and he's not a fool. As if summoned by their words, Thomas Mitchell's voice came from the darkness. No, I'm not a fool, though I'm beginning to wonder about my daughter's judgment. Sarah spun around to see her father standing at the edge of the firelight. Her heart sank. He'd heard everything. Thomas walked into the light, his expression unreadable. James immediately stepped away from Sarah, facing the older man with quiet dignity. Mr. Mitchell, I apologize. I never meant to compromise your daughter's reputation or take advantage of the situation. Thomas held up a hand. Save it, Crawford. I've been watching you two dance around each other for days now.
I knew this was coming. Father, I know this isn't what you wanted from me, but, Sarah began. What I want.
Thomas interrupted, then laughed. It was a bitter sound. What I wanted was to give you the world, Sarah. Instead, I dragged you across the country chasing a fool's dream. I almost got you killed by that broken wagon wheel. I put you in danger with outlaws. If it wasn't for Crawford here, I'd have lost you. He turned to James, his eyes serious. I know who you are, Crawford. Or rather, who you were. Heard the stories in Timber Creek. But I also know who you are now. You've kept us alive through these mountains. You've been honorable and decent even when it cost you. And most importantly, you make my daughter happy in a way I haven't seen since her mother died. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Father, Thomas held up his hand again. I'm not done. Crawford, I'm a businessman, or I was before this foolishness about silver mines. So let me put this in terms that make sense. What are your prospects? Can you provide for my daughter? Because love is all well and good, but it doesn't put food on the table. James straightened, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. I have savings from my years as a scout. Enough to buy some land, start a ranch maybe. I know horses and cattle. I'm not afraid of hard work. And I give you my word that I'll spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of her. A ranch, Thomas mused. Interesting. Margaret's letter mentioned something Denver was everything Sarah had imagined and nothing like she expected. The city sprawled across the plains at the foot of the mountains, a mixture of elegant brick buildings and rough wooden structures that spoke to its dual nature as both civilization and frontier town. The streets bustled with activity, from well-dressed businessmen to dusty miners fresh from the hills. Horse-drawn carriages competed with freight wagons for space on the wide avenues. They found Aunt Margaret's house in a respectable neighborhood on the edge of town. It was a modest but well-maintained Victorian with a white picket fence and a garden that showed signs of neglect. Margaret herself answered the door, and Sarah was shocked by her appearance. The vital, energetic woman she remembered from childhood visits had become thin and pale, moving slowly as if each step caused pain. "Sarah, Thomas." Margaret embraced them with tears in her eyes. "I prayed you'd come safely. These mountains can be so dangerous." "We had the best guide possible," Thomas said, gesturing to James, who hung back respectfully. "This is James Crawford. He brought us through safely." Margaret's sharp eyes assessed James in an instant. Despite her illness, she had the same keen intelligence Sarah remembered. "Crawford, I've heard that name. You're the scout who broke up that attempted ambush near Timber Creek. Word travels fast, even to old invalid women." James removed his hat politely. "Yes, ma'am. Just doing my job." "Just doing your job," Margaret repeated with a slight smile. "Well, Mr. Crawford, I'm grateful for that job. Come in, all of you. You must be exhausted." Over the next few days, a routine established itself. Sarah cared for her aunt, learning that Margaret suffered from a heart condition that doctors said was incurable but manageable with rest and proper medicine. Thomas threw himself into understanding Margaret's affairs, discovering that her late husband had indeed left her with considerable property, including the ranch land he'd mentioned to James. James, meanwhile, seemed uncertain of his place. He'd rented a room at a boarding house in town, visiting each day but always leaving before dinner. Sarah could see the struggle in him, the old habits of a solitary life warring with his desire to be part of something more. One afternoon, while Margaret napped and Thomas met with lawyers in town, Sarah found James in the garden, attempting to repair the broken fence. She watched him work for a moment, admiring the easy competence with which he handled the tools. "You don't have to keep your distance, you know," she said, making him jump slightly. "Aunt Margaret likes you. She told me this morning that any man who could keep her niece safe through an outlaw ambush was welcome at her table any time." James set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's not that simple, Sarah. In the mountains, on the trail, things were different. But here in Denver, you're a respectable young woman with a proper family. I'm just a scout with a questionable past." "You're the man I love," Sarah said firmly, crossing to stand in front of him. "And if you keep trying to talk yourself out of that, I'm going to hit you with that hammer." Despite himself, James smiled. "You've gotten fierce since Ohio. The West made me fierce. You made me fierce." Sarah took his hands, calloused and strong from years of hard work. "James, I understand you're scared." "I'm scared too. This is all new and uncertain. But running away won't make it less scary. It'll just make us both lonely." Before James could respond, Thomas called from the house. "Sarah, Crawford, come inside. Margaret wants to talk to us all." They found Margaret sitting in the parlor, looking more alert than she had in days. Thomas sat beside her, and Sarah noticed he was holding some papers. "Sit down, both of you," Margaret instructed. When they complied, she fixed them with that sharp gaze. "Sarah, your father has told me everything, about your journey, about the dangers you faced, and about your feelings for Mr. Crawford. He's also told me about Crawford's past." Sarah's heart sank. Was her aunt going to forbid the relationship? But Margaret surprised her. "Mr. Crawford, I'm a widow who married for love against my family's wishes. My husband was a gambler and a dreamer, but he was also the kindest man I ever knew. He bought that ranch land thinking he'd raise horses, but his heart gave out before he could make anything of it. I've been trying to decide what to do with it for 2 years now." She paused, gathering her strength. "Thomas tells me you know ranching, that you're honest and hardworking, that you saved his daughter's life and want to build a future with her. Is all that true?" "Yes, ma'am," James said quietly. "Then I have a proposal. The ranch is yours on 2 conditions. First, you marry my niece properly, with a church wedding and all the respectability that entails. Second, you make that ranch profitable within 3 years. If you can't, the land reverts to me or my heirs. But if you succeed, it's yours outright, along with a share of any profits for Thomas here, who'll be investing his remaining capital in the venture." Sarah's breath caught. Her aunt was giving them everything they needed to start their life together. James seemed overwhelmed. "Ma'am, that's incredibly generous, but I can't accept charity." "It's not charity, it's business," Margaret said crisply. "That land has been sitting empty, earning nothing. You'll work it, make it valuable. Everyone benefits, and you'll give my niece the life she deserves." That's payment enough for an old woman who won't be around much longer to see what becomes of her property. Don't talk like that, Sarah protested. But Margaret waved her off. I'm realistic, dear. My heart won't last forever. But knowing you're settled, happy, building something good, that's worth more than money. She looked at James again. Well, Mr. Crawford, do we have a deal? James looked at Sarah, then at Thomas, and finally back to Margaret. On one condition of my own. I want to do this properly. Sarah deserves a proper courtship, not just a business arrangement that leads to marriage. Give me 6 months to get the ranch started, to prove I can make something of it. If after that time Sarah still wants to marry me, knowing what life on a working ranch really means, then I'll be the happiest man alive. Margaret laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise even her with its strength. A man with principles. I like that. 6 months it is. But you'll court her properly, Crawford. Sunday dinners here, chaperoned visits, the whole respectable business. I won't have tongues wagging about my niece. Agreed, James said solemnly. Thomas stood, extending his hand to James. Partners, then. We'll draw up the papers tomorrow. As James shook his hand, Sarah felt tears of joy streaming down her face. Everything was falling into place in a way she couldn't have imagined when she'd left Ohio. The West had taken so much from her, had tested her in ways she'd never expected. But it was giving back something precious, a chance at a life filled with purpose and love. That evening, after James had left for his boarding house, Sarah sat with her aunt in the gathering dusk. Margaret reached out and took her hand. Your mother would be so proud of you, Margaret said softly. She always worried that you were too gentle for this harsh world, but she underestimated you. You've got steel in your spine, Sarah Mitchell, just like she did. I didn't feel strong on that wagon when the wheel broke, Sarah admitted. I felt terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear, dear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You've shown remarkable courage on this journey, and now you're brave enough to choose love even when it means uncertainty and hard work. Sarah squeezed her aunt's hand. Tell me about your husband, about choosing love over security. Margaret smiled, her eyes distant with memory. Everyone said I was a fool. He had no prospects, no family name, nothing but dreams and a good heart. But oh, Sarah, we had such happiness. Brief, yes, but so bright it lit up my whole life. When he died, I grieved, but I never regretted loving him. That's the secret, you see. It's better to have 1 year of true love than a lifetime of comfortable indifference. They sat together as night fell over Denver, the mountains dark shapes against the starlit sky. Somewhere out there was the trail Sarah had traveled, the places where she'd been tested and transformed. And somewhere in town was James, probably lying awake in his boarding house room wondering if he deserved this second chance at life. 6 months, Sarah thought. 6 months to build a ranch, to prove themselves, to turn possibility into reality. It seemed like both an eternity and no time at all. But she wasn't worried. She'd crossed the mountains, survived an ambush, and discovered strength she didn't know she possessed. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them the same way she'd faced everything since that moment when James Crawford had caught her falling and promised she was safe with him. She was safe with him. And together, they would build something lasting, something that would prove worthy of all the struggles that had brought them to this moment. The journey from Ohio to Denver had been long and dangerous, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be, to the person she was meant to become, and to the love she was meant to find. 6 months passed like water flowing over stones, shaping everything it touched. James threw himself into the ranch work with a determination that bordered on obsession. The property Margaret had given them was 15 miles outside Denver, a sprawling piece of land with good grass, a creek running through it, and spectacular views of the mountains. It also had a half-finished barn, a cabin that leaked, and fences that had collapsed from years of neglect. Every Sunday, James came to town for dinner at Margaret's house as propriety demanded. He would arrive scrubbed clean, his best shirt pressed, bearing small gifts like wildflowers or a fresh rabbit for the stew pot. They would eat together, the 4 of them, and afterward James would walk with Sarah in the garden, while Thomas and Margaret watched from the parlor window like benevolent guardians. During those walks, James would tell her about his progress, how he'd repaired the cabin roof and chinked the walls against winter, how he'd rebuilt the corrals and mended miles of fence, how Thomas had purchased 20 head of cattle and a breeding bull along with 6 horses, how slowly, week by week, the ranch was taking shape. But what moved Sarah most was the change in James himself. The haunted look in his eyes was fading, replaced by something that looked like hope. He walked taller, spoke with more confidence. The man who'd been running from his past was finally building a future. Sarah visited the ranch twice during those months, both times heavily chaperoned by her aunt despite Margaret's declining health. She saw the transformation James had worked, the raw land becoming something productive and promising. But more than that, she saw the pride in his eyes as he showed her around, the way he talked about plans for spring planting and expanding the herd. "This is real," he told her, standing in the doorway of the cabin he'd rebuilt with his own hands. "This isn't a dream that'll vanish come morning. I'm making something that'll last, Sarah. Something worthy of you." Margaret's health continued its slow decline through those months, but she seemed determined to live long enough to see Sarah married. She spent her better days planning the wedding with fierce attention to detail, insisting that her niece would have a proper celebration despite the frontier setting. As the 6-month mark approached, James came to Sunday dinner looking more nervous than Sarah had ever seen him. He barely touched his food, and his hands shook slightly as he held his coffee cup. After dinner, instead of their usual garden walk, he asked to speak with Thomas and Margaret formally. Sarah waited in the parlor, her heart pounding while the three of them talked in hushed tones in the dining room. Finally, they called her in. James stood by the window silhouetted against the autumn sunset. Thomas and Margaret sat at the table, both smiling. "Mr. Crawford has something to ask you, Sarah," Margaret said, her voice warm with affection. James turned, pulling something from his pocket. It was a simple gold ring, slightly worn. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The only thing of hers that survived the war and the years after. I've carried it with me all this time, thinking I'd never have reason to use it." He crossed to where Sarah stood, dropping to one knee in the proper fashion. "Sarah Mitchell, these 6 months have been the happiest of my life and the hardest. Happy because I've gotten to know you, to see the remarkable woman you are. Hard because every day I've had to leave you and go back to the ranch alone. I don't want to do that anymore." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as he continued. "I'm not a perfect man. I've got a past I'm not proud of, and I'll be working this ranch until the day I die because that's what it takes to make something succeed out here. I can promise you hard work, early mornings, and probably more struggles than luxuries. But I can also promise you my whole heart, my complete devotion, and a partner who'll stand by you through whatever comes. Will you marry me, Sarah? Will you make that ranch our home and build a life with me?" "Yes," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." James slipped the ring on her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms. Behind them, Thomas cleared his throat loudly, reminding them they weren't alone, but he was smiling. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, looking more alive than she had in weeks. "Well then," Margaret said briskly, "we have a wedding to plan. I'm thinking early December, before the worst of winter sets in. That gives us 6 weeks. Thomas, you'll give her away? And Crawford, you'll need a best man. Do you have someone?" James hesitated. "Actually, I was hoping to ask Dutch Henderson. He should be back in Denver by now with the wagon train." "Perfect," Margaret declared. "Now, Sarah, we need to discuss your dress." The next 6 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah hardly had time to think, caught up in fittings and arrangements and the 100 details that went into even a simple frontier wedding. But in the quiet moments, usually late at night, she would look at her mother's ring on her finger and marvel at how far she'd come. A year ago, she'd been in Ohio grieving her mother, with no idea what her future held. Now she was about to marry a former outlaw-turned-rancher, about to become a partner in building something from nothing in the wild Colorado territory. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The wedding took place on a crisp December morning in Denver's small church. Sarah wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair since cultivated blooms were impossible to find that time of year. Thomas walked her down the aisle, his eyes bright with tears. James waited at the altar in a new suit, Dutch Henderson beside him looking uncomfortable in his own formal attire. But what Sarah remembered most wasn't the ceremony itself. Though the words were beautiful and meaningful, it was the look in James's eyes as she walked toward him, a look of complete love and wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. It was the strength of his hand holding hers as they spoke their vows. It was the way he kissed her after the minister pronounced them married, gentle and reverent. A kiss that spoke of promises and possibilities. The reception was held at Margaret's house, with neighbors and friends Sarah had made during her months in Denver. Dutch Henderson told embarrassing stories about James's early days as a scout. Thomas gave a speech about second chances and new beginnings that had everyone reaching for their handkerchiefs. And Margaret, wrapped in blankets despite the warm fire, smiled with satisfaction at seeing her plans come to fruition. As evening fell and guests began to leave, James borrowed a horse and buggy to take his new wife home to the ranch. Sarah said goodbye to her father, who would stay with Margaret and promised to visit often. Margaret hugged her tight, whispering, "Be happy, dear girl. You've earned it." The ride to the ranch under the stars was quiet, both of them overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd done. When they finally arrived, James carried Sarah over the threshold of the cabin, setting her down gently in what was now their home. The cabin was simple but clean, with a fire already laid in the hearth. Someone, probably Thomas, had left supplies and provisions, but what caught Sarah's attention was the care James had taken with small details. Curtains hung in the windows, though they were clearly his own rough handiwork. A bouquet of dried wildflowers sat on the table, and over the fireplace hung a simple wooden sign that read, "Crawford Ranch, Eastern 1882. "It's perfect," Sarah said, turning to her husband. The word still felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. Husband. James pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find this was all a dream. That I'm still that angry kid riding with outlaws. Or the lonely drifter wandering the mountains. That someone like you couldn't possibly want someone like me." Sarah pulled back to look at him. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day? When you caught me falling from the wagon?" "You're safe with me," James recalled. "That's when I started falling in love with you," Sarah confessed. "Not falling from the wagon, but falling for you. Because in that moment I knew you were a man who kept his promises, and you've proven it every day since." James kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Sarah felt the last of her doubts and fears melt away. This was right. This was where she belonged. Not in comfortable Ohio with its familiar streets and predictable future, but here in this rough cabin on the edge of civilization, with this complicated man who'd fought so hard to become better than his past. Outside, the wind whistled across the prairie, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. Inside by the fire, Sarah and James Crawford began their life together. It wouldn't be easy. They both knew that. Running a ranch in Colorado territory required backbreaking work, courage, and more than a little luck. There would be hard winters, financial struggles, and probably more dangers they couldn't yet imagine, but they would face it all together. The scared girl who'd nearly fallen from a wagon and the reformed outlaw who'd caught her had both been transformed by their journey west. They'd been tested by mountains and outlaws, by loss and fear and uncertainty, and they'd emerged stronger, ready to build something lasting. Sarah thought about her mother's words that Margaret had shared, about 1 year of true love being worth more than a lifetime of comfortable indifference. She thought about the wagon train, the ambush, the moment she'd first seen Denver from